IoT products are more like a system than a product itself. So it has an integration component and it has a services component.
Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
This is an episode of the Ventures in Industrial IoT series, brought to you by GE Ventures. In the series, we explore success factors and challenges in industrial IoT markets with CEOs, investors, and experts. Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight. I'm joined today by Daniel Elizalde. Daniel trains IoT product managers. His company is called Tech Product Management. Daniel has quite a extensive background in the space. He's also currently teaching product management for Internet of Things at Stanford University. He previously supported companies such as STEM, Volusion, Project 202, VI Technology, and National Instruments on their product management. And today we're going to be looking at Daniel's product management framework. And then we'll be looking at how he applies that to some of companies that he's worked with to help them develop new IoT solutions. Daniel, before we jump into the framework, give me a little background. How did you end up moving from the corporate side, working with specific companies, working with National Instruments, for example, towards now full-time teaching the practice of IoT product management?
First of all, thank you so much, Eric, for having me at your show. I'm really excited to be here. A little bit of a background about myself. I've been working with connected products for about 18 years, and I started my career at National Instruments as a systems engineer, and I had the opportunity to work in the consulting teams designing these types of solutions for many industries. And throughout my career, I've worked mostly in product leadership roles. And I've done everything from single contributor to my last role at STEM was head of products for creating a solution for adding energy storage to the smart grid. And one of the constants that I've seen throughout my career is the difficulty in managing what we call today IoT products that has had a lot of different names throughout the years, because it's a combination of technology and business strategy and user experience strategy, data strategy. I've always been passionate about sharing this knowledge and about the consulting and training teams. And so after many years working in these companies doing these products, I decided to take a step back and instead of having the impact on a single product or a single company, can I share some of my lessons learned with a broader audience so I can benefit more companies and more product teams around the world? And that's when I decided to step back and start my practice focusing on IoT product management. And I had the opportunity to consult with companies and an advisory role to teach at Stanford Continuing Studies, which I trained hundreds of product people in Silicon Valley. And then I also launched an online course to share this knowledge more broadly around the world. So it's been a really interesting and rewarding experience to learn from these product teams about their challenges in IoT and share my experiences, which the core of what I teach is a structured approach on how to manage IoT products.
Who do you find that you're normally working with? So at Stanford, maybe you can contrast Stanford and the online courses. Are these typically SMA teams that are getting into IoT? Maybe they have a great idea, but getting in for the first time? Are they multinational teams that are looking at transforming a traditional product line? Who would be, let's say, maybe there's not a typical student, but maybe you can give us a bit of a cross-section of the type of people that you're working with.
Definitely. I can approach it from two perspectives. I think from the individual roles, I would say about 60% of my students and clients are senior product managers that have been very successful in their role in the past, but they're now getting into IoT and realizing that it's way more complex than they had experienced. So they come to my courses and look at my material. About 30% is executives that are in a company that is adopting IoT for the first time, and they're looking to understand how to create a cohesive strategy, get buy-in from other people, understand what industry is doing. And then about 10% is people that are looking to get into IoT or product management. So they are engineering managers, experienced designers, data scientists, those types of professions. And then from a company perspective, it's interesting. It's divided almost in three ways. So a third of my audience is startups, very small companies that are looking to figure out how to take their idea to market. About a third of the companies are middle-sized companies that are launching IoT products and they want to scale a little bit more. And then about a third is the Fortune 20 companies that are looking for a structured approach to grapple with IoT within their organization. And they're trying to bridge the silos and they're trying to get a common understanding on how to approach this. So it's very varied, but the common thread is it's product leaders looking to advance their product offering by making it a connected offering and have some digital value there.
Interesting. And then I imagine that regardless of where they're coming from, they're engaging with your framework, kind of your methodology. But to what extent are they also engaging with each other? Maybe more at Stanford than online, I'm not sure. But I would imagine that it's also interesting for somebody that's coming from a more traditional multinational perspective to be learning the topic together with kind of a young startup, because they also have, let's say, different perspectives or potentially some insight to share with each other.
And that is right. Online, there's not a lot of interaction, although I have a private LinkedIn group where anybody that takes my courses can join and share and join that community. But during the Stanford courses, the way I organize the classes is that there's always a group project that they have to do throughout the 8 weeks of the course. And I organize them via industry interest. So, for example, anybody that has interest in energy, you can form a group. If you have interest in smart homes, form a group. If you have interest in healthcare, form a group. And within those groups, you can have people that are from Fortune 3 companies, or you can have people that are from a two-person startup. So the synergy between them and the exchange of ideas is really interesting to see how they approach their particular project throughout the class.
Great. And I really want to get into the framework, but one last question just to kind of frame our understanding. You're focused on product management. My feeling is that in IoT, a lot of solutions are more projects than products, meaning that there's still a lot of customization. Maybe if we look back in 5 or 10 years, these will have evolved into kind of more plug-and-play products, but a lot of the companies that I see through IoT One, for example, are basically working with a customer and developing a solution for them, and it feels a lot more like a project. Is that something that you also grapple with? How to do, let's say, highly customized solutions that might not be just a kind of a how do I develop this device, but it might be what's the architecture of a system, and then looking at it from that perspective?
That's a great question, and I think that speaks a lot about the state of the industry today. What I teach is that my perspective is that IoT products are more like a system than a product itself. So it has an integration component and it has a services component. So companies that are looking to get into IoT, they need to realize that there's a lot more than just the product that people buy. There's also, like I said, an integration component that could be hardware, software, could be APIs, could be integration with existing systems. And there's also probably a services component. So part of what my framework helps them identify is all these different things that you need to have in order to make a product successful. So even though I focus on product management for IoT, in reality, what people walk out of my classes with is an idea of how to create a cohesive product strategy, because it brings together all these different areas that you need to think about and make decisions about throughout the life of your product.
Let's dig into the IoT Decision Framework. Maybe you can first give us a high-level overview. I'd also be interested in hearing how you conceptualize this. What was the inspiration, or what experience led you to this structure?
Yeah, of course. The reason I came up with this idea was out of my own need of needing to talk to people in my own company and to train my product team on what is it that we are doing. And what happens with IoT, I'm sure you've experienced it as well, is that it combines a lot of different disciplines, and it's really hard to put your finger on what exactly are we doing? What is this IoT thing? It's very nebulous. So I wanted a way to break out IoT into basic building blocks that help you articulate what are we talking about and how does this translate to technology that I can actually touch and implement today. And so that was the reason why I created a framework. And of course, it went through several iterations, me being a product person, right? I tried it out in several forms until it got to the form that is today and what I teach today. So the framework has two parts, and I'll share a link with you so you can include it with your show notes. Think of it as a matrix, and it has two axes. And in the x-axis, you have what I call the IoT technology stack. So these are the 5 technology pieces that every IoT product has. And of course, it's an abstraction, right? But it helps us identify what are we talking about. So the technology stack has these 5 building blocks, which are device hardware, device software, communications, cloud platform, and cloud applications. An end-to-end IoT product will have all of those, but there are some companies that just provide one of the layers. Let's say if you're a cloud platform company, you just focus on that. But it's important to understand how all the other pieces fit together. So that's the first part of the framework. The second part is what I call decision areas. And these are the different areas in which product leaders need to think about and make decisions throughout the life of your product. And I have identified 6 decision areas. And I use them in this particular order. So from top to bottom is user experience decision area, data, business, technology, security, and standards and regulations. And the way you use the framework is by evaluating decisions at each decision area across each of the layers of the IoT technology stack. So for example, if you're talking about the UX decision area, then you'll need to evaluate how to create a great user experience at the device hardware level, at the device software level, communications level, cloud platform, and cloud applications level. So that gives you a structured approach to go through all the different decisions that you have to make across the technology stack to make sure that, first of all, have the questions to ask and then have a way to basically check the boxes on making sure that you cover all these different areas that are important when creating a product strategy. And I can go deeper into each of the areas, but I want to see if you have questions.
One of the challenges that I personally have when I'm kind of evaluating solutions is that these areas are all interlinked, right? So if maybe first I think around the perfect UX and I'm quite confident that we have a great UX. And then when we get down to security, we find that the security requirements disrupt the UX, right? So they require a lot of behavior and interfaces that disrupt the flow, the process flow, and so forth, or don't allow us to implement something. So there's a lot of back and forth. Maybe you can go into, I'm sure you walk us through the process, but my gut is that this is going to be the challenge, is that as you're walking through, you maybe first identify a great UX and then, the right data sources. But as you move down the stack, you're going to have to revert back and start challenging some of your previous assumptions and revising your plan. And that this is going to be a very iterative process. I was talking with, let's say, actually a fellow teacher at Stanford last week, and he pointed out that there's a lot of decision paralysis where people are looking at this matrix. Maybe they don't have the framework that you've laid out, but mentally they're looking at these different areas. It's very difficult to find the optimal solution because there's no one solution that optimally satisfies kind of all criteria here, and so it's around balances. And I think that's the big struggle. Maybe you can walk through how you use this framework to help companies make rational decisions when there's just a great deal of trade-off between these 6 decision areas that you've outlined.
That's an excellent observation. And that's one of the things that people benefit the most when using my framework, is because it already lays out all these different decision areas that you have to think about in an order that is progressive. And I'll explain why I organized it this way. But a lot of companies are thinking about these things, but they don't have a way to capture it or to just think it in an organized way. So it turns out to be all over the place, or different departments are thinking about different parameters. So by having one way of looking at things and a step-by-step process, it helps a lot with categorizing those decisions and then going into the trade-offs of each of the areas. So let me walk you through what each of the decision area covers and how they build on each other and why I built them in this order. So the first decision area is what I call the UX decision area, the user experience. And this is not just the aesthetics or the colors, or this is really understanding who your target audience is. And so the question that you want to answer in the UX decision area is, who are your users? And those mean internal users and customer users. And what are their needs? And the reason why I start with this decision area is because if you don't understand who your users are and what are their needs, then nothing else matters. And when I do advisory roles with companies, sometimes companies cannot get past this decision area because they can't really articulate what is it that they're trying to solve. So by understanding that, that's the first step. And of course, as I mentioned before, you try to answer that question across the IoT technology stack. Who are your users at the device hardware level, at the device software level, at the communications level, at the cloud platform level, and cloud applications? Because as you know, especially in industrial products, there's a lot of different users, and whoever is going to install the hardware is going to be probably different than the person that's going to be monitoring the data versus the person that's going to be providing the maintenance. And as a product manager, you need to understand all these different use cases and make trade-offs and make sure that you're covering all of them. So in what I teach in this decision area is how to identify all those different users so that you can start making decisions. The next decision area is what I call the data decision area. So once you understand your users, based on the user's needs, what data needs to flow through the stack? So what data needs to be collected at the device hardware? What data needs to be processed and generated at the device software level? What data needs to be transmitted into the communication channel to get to the cloud? What data needs to be processed at the cloud, and what data needs to be presented to the user? Then once you understand the users and the data, then you can go into the business decision area. Here, you're trying to answer the question, how will you monetize your solution? What are your costs and your build versus buy criteria? And of course, you do answer those questions across the stack. So for example, will I build or buy the device hardware? Will I build or buy the embedded software, etc.? And this is a key aspect, is that I focus on the business aspect of monetization once you understand your users and once you understand your data needs. A lot of companies lead with technology and then try to build a business case around it, but that usually doesn't work. The next decision area is technology. So once I know my users and I know what data is needed and I know how I'm going to monetize it and my business model and cost, then I can choose what technology I need in order to deliver this solution. The next decision area is the security decision area. And although this is later in the framework, it is baked in the thought process. So it's not going to wait until you release the product to think about security. You're doing this before you even start building anything. And the question that you're looking to answer here is, how will I secure each layer of the IoT technology stack? How will I secure my device hardware? How will I secure my device software, communications, etc.? And then the last decision area is standards and regulations. The questions that you want to answer here is, what standards and regulations apply to your product, to your customer, and to your industry at each layer of the stack? So those are the areas, and that's the order that I recommend going. And then once you go through the last one, as you mentioned before, you iterate. You go back to the beginning and say, based on all the other decisions that I've made, how do each of the previous decision areas change? And you do this a couple of times to get to what I call a steady state, making sure that now all of your decisions are consistent with each other. And when you have all the decisions being consistent, that's when you have a cohesive product strategy. And then to your question about trade-offs, at that point is when you can start making sure you talk to either your customers or to internal teams about what is more important for you. For example, just like you mentioned, if it turns out that providing the best user experience is going to make it too expensive and you won't be able to support your business model, okay, what gives, right? Is it okay to raise the price, or is it better to reduce the experience? Or it turns out that security, you're going to need to invest a big piece of money in security that breaks your business model. Well, what are the risks, and what are you willing to have a little bit less of stringent security in exchange of better costs initially? The key here is that now you have the tools to make those decisions because you're not thinking about it in the vacuum. You've done the work, and in my classes, my students fill out my IoT Decision Workbook, which is a companion to the framework, and it has a lot of the questions that you need to answer. And at least you have a basis to make those decisions. And what happens sometimes that I've seen with companies is that they don't have a way to make these decisions in an organized way.
I think very clear. There's a very challenging environment here. I think your framework gives it a great structure. A couple questions I have for how to address kind of the complexity of the solution. So my assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, my assumption is that a lot of companies would want to start with technology because that's what they would take as given. They say, we have this technology, this is what we have, and we want to find applications for it. And then they would basically want to move that technology from the fourth place in your stack up to number one and say, okay, based on this technology, what can we do with it? Is that often the initial approach that people would take?
Yes, I see that approach to be more common in smaller companies, especially startups here in the Bay Area. They have this technological idea and they want to push that forward. And I've actually had a few success stories in that sense where when I have discussions with these companies and we go from the beginning and say, let's forget your technology. Let's try to figure out what problem you're really looking to solve and for whom, and do some research, right? They realize that actually there is no market for that solution, or that the solution in the way that they were packaging was not going to work. And so that helps them save a lot of money, because otherwise they would have been ready to start engaging Chinese manufacturers to produce at scale when they don't even know if they have a valid product. And so my first recommendation is always to be able to see if you can articulate your value proposition, if you understand your users, and you can validate that, and then move to the next one and the next one and the next one. So that's always been my approach. And that's always the first thing that I spend with when I talk to customers and even my students, is to try to take them away from the technological solution. Because from my experience being a head of product and even an engineer, I know that we can build pretty much whatever we want. So that's not the problem with the state of the art of technology today. The real problem is there value? Is people going to pay for that solution? Are we solving an important problem?
We could be addressing quite a few. I mean, when I talk to younger companies in particular, I'll often ask them, who is your target market? And we have a list of 27 industries. And quite a few companies will just go down the list and check all of the industries and say, yeah, all these guys can use our technology. And you say, well, that's great, but like, who are you actually trying to sell to? So this process, I guess you could, starting at UX, you could look at quite a few different potential user groups. Is that how you'll approach this? Will you basically say, let's iterate through this framework very quickly with all of the different potentials, and then we'll maybe prioritize the ones that are most interesting and take that further? How do you apply this to environments where there are multiple potential end user groups? And so it's and until you kind of play that out, at least to the technology standpoint, you need to, I guess, take that discussion forward so that you can see, do we actually have the UX, the data, the business, and the technology all aligned? And then maybe it makes sense to also look at security and standards. How do you address that challenge?
That's exactly right. The way I address it is by focusing on one particular user type and identifying if their pain is enough that they are willing to pay for it. The fact that your solution can work in many different industries or verticals doesn't mean that it will. And also, I always ground my students and companies that I work with in the size of their company. If you are a small startup, then even if your product was scalable to multiple verticals, you don't have the resources right now to scale at that level. So focus on one, prove the value, get your foothold there, and then figure out how you can scale to other verticals if that makes sense. But one of the main things I work with companies is narrowing down your user personas, narrowing down. And then the other thing is when I mention about the UX decision area, about identifying your users, internal and external. By internal, I also mean, for example, your sales team. So when you start looking at the different internal teams that are required to move forward a product, it's just not the product itself, it's everything that revolves around it. So do you have the sales team to actually go and sell into 27 different verticals? Do you have the marketing reach to be able to market properly to 27 different markets? Probably not, right? So that way you can also help and narrow down and realize that even if you just focus on one market, there's going to be a myriad of internal and external users that you're going to have to satisfy to begin with, and that's going to be challenging enough. The other thing that I always point out, and this is another aspect that the framework is useful, is to show the complexity of an IoT product. The fact that you have 5 layers in the IoT technology stack makes it way more complicated than if you're just doing a mobile app, for example, which is complex enough. So given the complexity and the uncertainty of building an IoT product, and you still want to scale that to 27 verticals at the first time, that is just not manageable. So I try to advocate for reducing it just because the complexity. And as companies go through the framework and they start uncovering all the different questions and complexity, they very quickly realize that having 10 personas is too much and having 5 personas is too much. And okay, let's start with one because otherwise it's going to be impossible.
I'm not sure if you have kind of a ballpark number at hand, but what do you believe is the average or the range of technology providers that are involved in a typical solution? So if we're looking across these 5 layers of the stack, are we talking typically around 3 or 5 different technology providers? Are we looking at a complete solution maybe into 10 or 20 providers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Depends on the industry, but usually you have at least 1 or 2 in the device hardware layer because you have sensors, and then you have the data acquisition and instrumentation and the gateway type of hardware. Then you probably have a handful in the device software because you need everything from the device operating system, and then you need some supporting software like over-the-air updates and identity management and security management, those kind of things. And that's on top of what your application is, right? Communications, you will have a main communication provider to the cloud, but also you might need to communicate with local devices, especially in industrial, that's very common. So you will have other providers that integrate with you. At least 1 or 2 for the cloud and for analytics software, and then several others for cloud applications. So it becomes a pretty big ecosystem. And that is one of the biggest lessons that I always share with my students and companies, that I believe IoT is an ecosystem play. I think one of the biggest challenges that companies make is that they go at it thinking that they have to do everything. And oftentimes you see a software company starting to do hardware or sensors, or a hardware company starting to get into embedded software. And it's just really hard. My advice is always to be mindful of what are your core competencies. And then part of the role of the product leader is to focus your engineering team on that and building a strong partner ecosystem that can support the rest of the end-to-end stack.
Perfect. And that's actually a great transition maybe to shifting the conversation to some examples of how companies have practically used this framework to help drive their product development. I know we have to keep names confidential here, but can you think of maybe a company that had a challenge with, let's say they have a particular need in mind, and they used the framework to help manage the complexity and put their technology in the scope of a larger solution, where they were able to identify which areas they want to focus on internalizing and which areas they're going to work with partners on. Maybe we can use that then as kind of a jump-off point to speak around a particular company's experience using the IoT Decision Framework.
Yes, for sure. I can tell you about different perspectives. I think one interesting one, a small startup that was working or is working on the smart home type of environment. And I think this was one of the typical examples where you're leading with technology, and they had a really interesting technological solution, and they were interested in figuring out how they commercialized it. And I engaged with them, and we started going through the framework. And as happens very often, we were not able to get past the UX decision area because it was not very clear what problem exactly they were going to solve. And so instead of pushing through the next stages of engineering, the next steps that I recommended were to try to do more of that customer development UX research to really identify who are you selling to and figure out if they actually need your solution, right? And so that was a big aha moment for them to understand all the different pieces that are involved and how their technology might not really have a place, right? And so being able to stop and take a step back and say, instead of putting all of our startup resources in engineering right now, let's actually put them on customer development and actually hash out our product strategy and then move forward. So I think that's an example of, by being able to have a framework to point to and open the discussion, they were able to get to these conclusions.
I was talking with the guys over at GE Ventures the other day, and they were saying what they're really trying to focus on is how they can provide value for startups, aside from financing. And this was one of the main areas that they identified, was how, they have fairly good insight through GE Digital and so forth into specific, real end user demand, right? So people are looking for a solution to this problem, and they can potentially help startups to identify user demand and say there's basically an open market here if your solution is the right fit. But then it's also a matter of finding that right partner. So when we get down to the business and technology levels around finding the partners that can help you to fill out your solution, or at the UX, finding the partners that can help you to identify, because a lot of startups they're not coming from, there was a company that was, let's say, disrupting the construction business, and the CEO made the point, I've never worked in the industry before. I have no experience here. And that maybe gives them a fresh perspective, but it also means that they have very little insight into what the actual life on the ground is. In the framework, to what extent do you encourage this? Do you encourage kind of this startup connecting with the large company, or how do companies find this information if they're from a startup perspective, for example, and you said they can build out their sales team. Some companies, that's an option. Some companies don't have the funding to do that. So in order to find the missing technology, find the missing information around actual end user requirements, what approach do you recommend?
Very good point. A lot of my goals when working with companies and students is to help them understand what questions they need to ask. Because oftentimes IoT being so complex, it's hard to even know the questions to ask. Like, for example, that you need a specialized sales force if you're going to go into different verticals. And so by going through the framework, they identify all these different things that you always take a step back and say, okay, if we really want to make this happen, what are the different players that we need? I teach a couple of techniques to have a build versus buy decision criteria to uncover users at different stages of the IoT life cycle. So by combining all those different things, you realize all the things that you're going to need. Then it's up to you as a company to figure out how do you actually go ahead and do that. And of course, I sometimes serve as an advisor, and I say, well, based on my experience, I recommend you look at this and this and this. But a lot of it, the aha moment comes from just knowing that they have to do that. And in a parallel example, it's been really interesting to me. There's been several companies that have approached me as a way to train their customers on creating a product strategy. So these are companies that produce either technology for each part of the technology stack, or they are contract manufacturers, or they are solution integrators. And one of their main struggles is that their customers don't come to them with a cohesive strategy. And so they kind of get the feeling that they're not going to be successful, therefore they won't be able to be successful. And so I've been working with some of them to help train their customers to iron out their product strategy before they go into working with his partner, whatever that might be. So it's an interesting way how we're seeing the ecosystem play together. But there's truly a lot of what I'm seeing is this gap of understanding all the different pieces, how they fit together to create a cohesive strategy and creating a plan moving forward.
Very interesting dynamic, but I guess that makes sense because an SI, in order to be successful, they need the product, the solution to scale. No reason helping to bring a product to market if it's not going to grow into a sizable business. Daniel, talk to us a little bit about, let's say, the trade-off between perfection and just getting a product out to POC or to market. So because of the complexity of an IoT product, there's a lot of potential decision bottlenecks where you could be spending months looking for the right partner or developing the right technology. And there's also risk in pushing out something that doesn't meet a real need or has a security concern or a technology gap that's going to influence usability. So not an easy decision, but how do you help companies to kind of address this go, no-go decision?
The way I advise companies is to really understand what the problem they're trying to solve is and for whom, and then what is the minimum viable product that they can put out. I know that that's word's overused, but what is the minimum thing that they can create so that they can test out the market and start ironing out the kinks? And the key here that I recommend is that for your first iteration of the product to gain traction, it's better to use as much off-the-shelf technology as you can to put something together, because you're really looking to test out the value proposition that you're providing, not necessarily the technological implementation. So for example, there have been some companies that they want to wait a year before launching their first pilot because they want the hardware to be reduced to a size where it's manageable and it's going to be easy to sell, from a Best Buy kind of thing, right? Or if they're an industrial company, they want to have a certain amount of power or a certain amount of things, and they want to go through that whole hardware process to come up with a product that looks kind of like the final version, just to see if they can try out the concept. My advice has always been use off the shelf as much as you can. Don't worry about cost or size when you are just trying to prove out the concept. You can always miniaturize it later. You can always reduce the cost later. But if you get the value proposition and the willingness to pay wrong, there's nothing else you can do. And especially in industrial type of products, what customers are really buying is a solution to a problem, and that has usually a service attached to it. So you can do all that with a clunky solution put together with off-the-shelf parts. But what you're after is demonstrating the concept and the viability.
Totally makes sense. And then do you recommend that companies, in order to get this feedback, they go through kind of a crowdsourcing website if they're on the consumer market, or they just put together kind of a pilot group of customers that they have a good relationship with if they're in the industrial? How do they actually get this then, this kind of beta version of the product out into customers' hands so that they can get the input that they need?
Yeah, and those are some of the traditional product management techniques that you can see about just putting your product in the hands of your customers. And if you are in an industrial way, for example, just as you mentioned, find a few customers that are willing to try out your product, that you have identified the need, and they are willing to try something out, and build those relationships with them. But the important thing is to be very clear that they're helping you finalize the details, and they're really testing out this. I see some companies that are doing their quote unquote pilot projects, but they're already trying to sell into critical infrastructure, into something that is really vital for the company. And there's a lot of risk. So you want to be trying things in the real world with the minimum risk possible and find those champions that can help you get there. It's easier said than done, but especially in industrial IoT, there's millions of dollars at play, and you don't have that luxury of getting it wrong when you put it in full production. So it's better to start small and until you get it right, and then get the adoption from there. Plus, you also need the referrals and the testimonials of the first happy customer, and that's how you build it up, following the philosophy of Crossing the Chasm book, if you're familiar with that one.
Daniel, I'm wondering if you can give me one more kind of case study. And what I haven't, so you've explained kind of how let's say a technology startup could use this framework. They have maybe they've already brought a technology through development and now they're looking for the market, or a multinational that maybe knows where the market is and they're trying to figure out the technology. There's a third group that I think is quite interesting, because if we look at kind of the economy, a lot of the economy is still driven by medium-sized companies building simple things that we've been using for the past 100 years, so screwdrivers and so forth, the kind of things that we don't really think about. And these companies, I feel like in the economy are feeling a bit of the pinch, right? There's a lot of VC money to fund startups, and the larger technology corporates are doing quite well. But then these companies kind of in the middle of the economy, these more traditional industries, feeling quite a strong pinch. I have a friend that is on a little bit of a mission to try to help some of these companies evolve their product. So he has a yacht, and so he knows that one of the problems in a yacht is if you screw a bolt too tight or too loose, it can be a very expensive problem because it can break or it can leak. And if you have a leak on a boat, that becomes a hefty bill. And so he was looking at helping a company develop kind of a smart screwdriver where it always applies the right amount of torque, just as an example. But do you have experience where you're working with a very traditional kind of old school business building a very traditional product, and that this type of company is now trying to think, how do we bring our product into the 21st century, so to speak, in order to differentiate ourselves?
That's a really good challenge to have. And I think that I have worked with some companies like that, where they're trying to figure out, so how do we leverage this? And the discussions that I've had with them is to think about IoT as a tool. It's not a silver bullet or nothing else. It's just a tool. The problems that your customers have, they've had them already, and they've had them for a long time. So your product is not coming in and discovering new problems to solve. What I recommend is thinking of how can you leverage IoT to provide a better, faster, cheaper solution to problems that your customers already have. So part of the challenge there is understanding what are those customers' problems. And so you just mentioned a perfect example of the yacht, and the problem that if you screw something too much, then water gets in, and that's a big problem. Now, what does IoT give you? It provides the ability to have sensors so that you can measure the world around it, provide some intelligence with that data, either locally or on the cloud, so that you can either improve a process, reduce time, reduce costs, etc. And so the challenge with the yacht, it existed already. But if you are able to provide a better, faster, cheaper solution by incorporating some of the tenets of IoT, that's where the companies should move forward. And in the discussions that I had with companies, sometimes they say, well, we're a traditional company and we want to just add some sensors to generate some data. But why? Right? What is the benefit? I worked with a company that did monitoring of cold storage for supermarkets. And they were thinking of adding more sensors to check for the temperature and display it on a dashboard. And my question as we were working together was, well, what is the problem? The customer is not asking for more temperature data. The real problem is that if the refrigerator breaks, they lose millions of dollars in their food and they affect their supply chain. So how can you really help them solve that particular problem by adding sensors and actuators and being able to remotely control those. So that's kind of the discussions that I usually have. And it's all about making up something better, faster, cheaper with the technology that we have available today.
Yeah, I love that perspective. IoT, it's just another set of technologies that's coming to market, and it's just a question of can those technologies help you to build a better product, right? Daniel, I love what you're doing. Anything else that you want to share with us before we round out the podcast?
I want to just thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I believe IoT has a lot of potential to solve a lot of big problems that we have in the world today. And I do believe that the biggest trend in IoT is not necessarily all this myriad of technologies, but it's about taking a step back and figuring out your product strategy and figure out what is the problem that you're really trying to solve and doing it better. I think as companies continue to take that step back and that becomes a trend, that's the only time where we're going to be able to see the real adoption of IoT, because it is focused on solving real problems. And that, of course, results in more return on investment and revenue, et cetera. So I encourage all companies to take a step back and think about their holistic product strategy. And of course, they can use a framework like mine and, my different courses online and Stanford, et cetera, to help them kind of align all the different pieces. Because I think IoT is more of a jigsaw puzzle, right? It's all about putting all these different pieces together, and so that you can make the right decisions.
Daniel, we'll put the links to your website and your Stanford course in the show notes. But how do you prefer people that are listening to reach out to you if somebody's interested in learning more about the framework or discussing a project with you?
For sure. People can go directly to TechProductManagement's.com and they can contact me through there. The easiest way to contact me is via email. You can reach me at daniel@techproductmanagement.com or at Twitter as well, Elizalde. So either of those work. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So I would love to hear from different people, see how they're managing their IoT process, and hopefully I can be a little bit of assistance in providing a structured approach, which is what I strive to do.
Daniel, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@IoT1.com.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Ventures in Industrial IoT series. You can learn how GE Ventures goes beyond funding to support their partners in technology development and commercialization at www.geventures.com.